Michael, hello, how are you doing?
Doing well, Andy. Doing well. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. We're completely thrilled to have you, so thank you for taking part in this conversation. We're beginning videos by just asking our contributors to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do. So do you mind starting by doing that?
Okay, my name is Michael Oku. I wrestle as the OJMO across the British wrestling industry. Uh, yeah, that's pretty much all I do.
And how long have you been doing that for?
I've been doing it. We've reached 3 years now from training.
Great.
Doing it.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're just beginning this series on wrestling for our video channel. And you very kindly said you were interested in taking part and you had an interest in kind of where we were at from wrestling. So maybe we should start from there. You know, what brought you to this conversation? What interests you in weird people like me who want to talk about wrestling?
I'm always intrigued in a study. Like if there's a study on a subject, I'm always intrigued to see where people approach it from, and especially, and then because I'm involved in professional wrestling, um, I always like when there's articles done about it. If there's anything to publicize it, and at least just put more um, interest on it, and especially look at it from a different point of view, because I feel like there are certain point of views that wrestling's looked at that are one-dimensional,
Yeah.
and there's so many different aspects to it. And so the fact that you're exploring it through the history of acting, the history of like sports, as well as and just the history of wrestling in general is really intrigued me.
Great, fantastic. Yeah. I guess we want to take wrestling really seriously, but do it in a way which keeps it being fun and keeps it being all the joyful things that is at the same time as trying to take it seriously. But yeah, for me, there's a really long history there in audiences watching combat, and that could be combat within a play, and it could be combat in a theatre. And the long history of theatre, those buildings and those spaces are often fight halls, boxing venues, space for martial arts. It feels like that's a conversation that hasn't really happened yet. And I also feel wrestling's got lots to teach us about how performance works, both now and in the past. I spend a lot of time in rehearsal rooms with performers, and I often hear directors say, particularly to male actors, perform this speech like a pro wrestler giving a promo. So that's a kind of a direction I hear all the time, and I always want to unpack that and play with that. So we were running an event this spring where we were going to put an actor and a professional wrestler next to each other and get them to deliver a speech as a pro wrestler and see how it works when you actually get a pro wrestler do it. Yeah. We can come back to more of that if you like, but I definitely want to make sure we base this video around you. So do you mind telling us a bit more about either your career or the kind of wrestling that you do? These videos are new for me as well, so I never know if I'm asking good questions, but yeah, I'd like to hear more about what it is to wrestle for you, if that's okay.
Well, yeah. So I mean, for me, I talk about my style of wrestling, and it's hard to pin it down to one particular thing, because I like doing the high flying, the acrobatic stuff, but I'm as big a fan as the grounded grappling aspect of pro wrestling. Not as versed as I'd like to be, but my I think my key attribute, which I've been told and I would agree with, is my selling. And for those that aren't aware of what that means, that just means how you emote that you're hurt, and how that you emote the pain that we're constructing in the wrestling match. That's one of my strong suits, and it's that emotion that helps crowds connect with me, and helps makes the matches that I'm in more dramatic. I was thinking, I was like juggling with the idea of when I was going to introduce myself as like to talk about like my wrestling accolades, because like I'm the current undisputed British cruiserweight champion. But it just seems like sometimes a weird thing to say, yeah, I've also got this belt in wrestling too, so I'm a champion. But that's a high, but it is a high achievement, especially on the UK independent wrestling scene. and I
Mm.
was able to achieve it in a short space of time. And I think that's down to my selling, more so than any other um, ability that I have in a wrestling ring.
Huh. Okay, that's really interesting. And it helps us think about, I guess you've divided up wrestling into three different kind of skill sets there. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but kind of the high flying and acrobatic stuff, which by the way, as an audience member and as a coward looks completely terrifying. Don't do that stuff. And then the kind of mat-based, ground-based grappling. And then perhaps the bit that people who are new to wrestling might not even think about as part of wrestling, which is the selling and the communicating of what it means to be at the hard end of a match. If I've got that right.
Precisely. I guess that's the acting part of it. What's interesting is, so I was an actor for 10 years actually. And I never went to a drama school, so I was never formally trained. But when I told people when I got into wrestling that I'm an actor, they were like, "Oh, so that's why you're good at selling." And I was like, and immediately my first thought is, well, that makes sense, but I've never been trained exactly how to act. So a lot of the selling, my selling, I credit on watching wrestling more than it is, studying studying Stanislavski, for example.
Right. Okay, so watching other wrestlers, learning how to do it yourself, how to embody it, and then communicating it to an audience is the journey.
If anything, yeah, if anything, wrestling, I always watched wrestling my whole life. If anything, I could say that wrestling helped with my acting. I used wrestling in my acting more than the other way around. I remember specifically, there was an audition I went to, and I specifically remember doing a facial expression that I saw Chris Jericho, who's a wrestler, do in a video promo.
Huh.
And I did exactly that. And I remember that being the highlight of the audition. And it's just kind of the poise and the confidence that a lot of wrestlers have is what I took into audition rooms as well as onto stage. And so, yeah, so it's always an interesting thing that like, you couldn't tell a theater director that, your influences are this professional wrestler over here. And when this wrestler did this in 2001, but it did help me to some degree.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Congratulations on the championship you have, by the way. I should have said that when you mentioned it. That's fantastic. And I should say that I've seen you mostly at Soul Wrestling.
Oh, right.
But actually, the last time I saw you, Michael, you were being extremely mean to poor Callum Newman at, is it London Lucha Wrestling? He just finished a match. You got involved. I mean, you seem very nice now, but I wasn't happy at the time.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that's such that's the fun part of wrestling in the sense that like, so I winning the British Cruiserweight Championship. Which I did across the road at York Hall. I do that, and I'm like in front of like 1,000 cheering fans. I'm like the ultimate like underdog hero that's achieved this dream, and then I can cross the road and then like rock up in all black and attack a 17-year-old and say that he doesn't deserve to be, he doesn't deserve to be what he is, and this, that, and the other. So I can be completely mean, literally. By crossing a road, I can be a different character, which is always the interesting thing about wrestling. But then there's always that thing in my mind where I'm trying to keep some things consistent with my character, like like across all promotions, it's the same character, just with different intentions, different goals, and different slants of it.
Yeah, different attitudes maybe. I like that idea. What is going on there? Like, do you need kind of continuity of narrative, and are you just playing to different audiences and therefore it doesn't matter? Or actually, are you kind of rebooting your character from promotion to promotion?
I think this is where the benefit of wrestling fans knowing that it's entertainment comes into play, because I don't think personally that you need to be exactly the same across different promotions, because the wrestling fans, especially in the UK, independent UK scene, it's like it's a niche of a niche, that industry. So it is a very small, when it comes down to it, percentage of people that are
Yeah.
watching it. And so they are aware of multiple promotions up across the country, in Wales or even in Wolverhampton. There will be the same fans going to those shows as ones in London or Brighton. So they know who you are and they know the stuff you do. But because they know that, because they're aware of the entertainment aspect of wrestling, I think they might even enjoy more. I heard a few wrestlers talking about this same thing, where I think they kind of enjoy the fact that, oh yeah, I can see him perform like this here, but if I go to this show, I'm seeing someone completely different. And there's some kind of joy to it. I guess it's the same way as, like, you know, an actor isn't playing the same character across different shows. Even though you might want to see that actor, sometimes when you just see their name on the bill, you're like, I'm going to see this film because they're my favorite actors in it. They'll be playing a completely different character, but you trust in their ability to perform something good. So I am this beloved hero babyface in multiple places, but then in a couple places, I'm like trying to wear obnoxious clothes and wrestle in a way that would get me hated.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I'd like to hear more about that. I'm trying to think of the best way to get into that. But does the persona you bring to those matches, does that depend on who you're wrestling as well as the promotion itself? And how does it change the way that you wrestle? You hinted there that it changes the sort of decisions you might make in the ring. That's two questions. Feel free to answer either or neither.
Well, I mean, I guess it is based down on the booking instructions of whatever promotion you're wrestling for. So if I'm booked to be a villain, then I'll be a villain. I guess an example was I spent the majority of last year as a champion in another promotion called Battle Pro, and I was champion there for 300 for like nearly the year, and I was a villain there. And that was the first time I was actually wrestling, like officially in a prominent promotion as a villain, where we did the most dastardly thing. And this is sometimes the weird thing about wrestling, is that we using social media to trick people. And they announced me for a match, and then they said I wouldn't be able to make the match, and like quietly alluded to the fact that there was an emergency that I couldn't make the match. And then I surprised everybody at the end of the show and beat the champion who just won a match. So like I capitalize on a dude who's just had a match, and then that started this this heel title reign that lasted 11 months. And for me, it was I guess the independent part of pro wrestling is how much freedom you have to then explore different types of characters. And I got to try, in my mind, I was being cheered in a lot of places and liked in a lot of places, but I wanted to make sure that it was such a far cry from what I do in those other places, so that there isn't anything that the fans can attach to. So it would mean that I would wear completely different things. I'd had different music. I wouldn't say my catchphrase. You know, things anything that they'd attach themselves to me for that they'd like, I wouldn't do it anymore. And that's just so that they can cheer the person that I'm wrestling. And the end goal of when you're a villain champion is that when you are beaten for that title, the crowd are elated. And the mission was accomplished when Dave Francisco beat me for it. So, and it's a great thing when you're booed and you're like, I'm doing a great job. And then when everybody's happy to see you get beaten up, you're like, yes, I'm doing an even better job.
And how does that feel? Either emotionally or physically?
Well, that's yeah. It feels. It's like when people. So there's a lot of people who use the word art to describe wrestling, and it's because of the creative aspect of it. And when that happens for me, because I thought that there was a chance it wouldn't work in terms of being booed the way I was. When it happens that you are getting booed, and when it culminates in like nearly 12 months essentially of storytelling culminates with its conclusion of you being defeated, and then the crowd are just I mean, jumping for joy. There is that feeling of creative satisfaction. They're like, right, what we tried to do worked. That's the most important feeling. You're like, yes, it worked. When you go backstage, you're like, yes, great, perfect, it all worked. That's what I think about most, especially even when winning as a hero or villain. When you get that loud reaction from a crowd, you're like, okay, great, it worked.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. I guess the other place that happens in modern culture is maybe pantomime, where you've got an actor actively trying really hard to get booed and to get to get emotional noises out of the audience. But again, for me, that's a really good link back to historical forms of theatre, which didn't have this notion that the audience should be quiet and polite and behave themselves, but had very loud audiences with people on stage trying really hard to whip those audiences up and to kind of polarize them, you know, for or against particular people on stage. So again, for me, this is yet another example of how wrestling's got lots to teach us about how performance worked historically before theatre became boring and in a quiet building where everyone behaving themselves. So that's really useful, I think. Michael, is it all right to go back to that idea you told us about earlier about kind of, again, I don't know if you meant to do this or not, but you seem to be breaking wrestling up into acrobatics, ground-based grappling, and selling. Can you tell us a bit more about that and moving between the three? And I mean, like I say, as an audience member and as a coward, the acrobatic stuff looks completely terrifying to me.
So I think those three aspects that I mentioned, it's very interesting. So because when you go to wrestling training, those are easily the high flying plus grappling, technical wrestling. Those are the two easiest things to that. They're just like the polar opposites of each other, and those are things that you probably learn more than anything if you go to training. I started training at Knuckle Locks in Brixton, and the key there, especially due to the people who train me, they're so adept at technical wrestling. So there was a base to be learned there, and I feel like that's an important base and should be everybody's foundation of wrestling, because a lot of that can be improvised basically when you're in the ring, and if you know how to do that well, then you can use that tool to take you arguably anywhere around the world, because a high flying wrestling, which is like primarily like a luchador Mexican wrestling based kind of style, that can come in and out of vogue. Hardcore deathmatch wrestling with chairs and tables, barbed wire and stuff, again, that's in and out of vogue. But wrestling's on the marquee, and it will always be there. So by learning the ground-based style of wrestling, especially because historically in Britain, that is the style that was popular, I feel like that knowing how to do that well is like the key to longevity in wrestling. But then the high flying is just exciting, you know, and that's kind of why I do it. Honestly, sometimes it's not even like, oh man, I really want to do it. Sometimes it's like, this is what the crowd will respond to, and it'll make them think that I'm good at wrestling. So I'm gonna dive from the outside of the ring onto the floor because they'll cheer. And that's probably not the way to think sometimes psychology-wise in wrestling, but that is what works. So if it works, it works.
Yeah, that's great. Is there an element where acrobatics is an easier kind of spectacle than grappling, which potentially grappling is all about two guys focusing on each other, whereas presumably always you're thinking, how does this read to an audience and how can I show what we're doing to an audience? Is that easier with acrobatics than grappling? I don't know.
I think so, because usually with the acrobatic side, the high flying side, it's more visual. It is more visual in essence, because you're either traveling from a longer distance from a high height, so from that point of view, it's easier for the crowd to respond to it or react to it. However, there is that point of like with the technical wrestling, or with the wrestling match in general. Actually, if we're to talk about the construction of a wrestling match or what you're trying to achieve,
Hmm.
you're trying to put forward a narrative.
Yeah.
You're trying to tell a story within a specific amount of time that you're given. So to achieve that, for me and for a great professional wrestler, if you're a really good wrestler, you'll find a way to contextualize why you would need to do high flying moves. And you need to contextualize why it would be smarter to stay on the ground, or if it would actually make sense to leave the grounded work and start running around the ring or running around the ropes and stuff. So I think that answers the question, unless I forgot the question.
No, that's great. That's really great. I'm trying to think what context would ever make me want to get up onto the ropes, but yeah. So that's the context. There is you as a performer rather than the character wrestling, or is it both?
The context of what?
You say the kind of that if you're really a great wrestler, you're thinking about the contextual reasons why you might do some acrobatics, why you might get up in the corner or get up on the ropes. If I understood you rightly.
Yeah. So it'll be the context of like, is you as a professional wrestler. If you look at it as like in a video game, for example, like Tekken, I kind of think of it as like it's a video game full of characters with loads of different fighting styles. One of the fighting styles in the video game happens to be pro wrestling. And so you're going to use the techniques that you are well versed at to try and, defeat your opponent.
Yeah.
And so if pro wrestling is my fighting style, part of that would be to use high flying offense. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so when am I going to find the right time to use that high flying offense? Because I know that it's effective. And that's me looking at it from like the pro wrestling point of view, as a wrestler in a wrestling match kind of view. And then the performer aspect, you want to make sure, as a performer, the journey that you want to take the fans on is such that if you are going to do a high flying move, it needs to be at the right time. So if you are taking them on a roller coaster of emotions, it's going to be generally a high point of the match when one of the highest points of the match, you doing high flying based offense. So you want to make sure you put that in a place that makes sense. So either near the end of the match or near the end of one of the acts of a match. Yeah. And that's that's one of the ways that I've heard it be put, by the way, is like act 1, act 2, and act 3 of a wrestling match.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting to hear. I guess there's also an issue too, is there, about kind of scale and where people's bodies are, in that usually if one guy is going high, that's because another guy's ended up on the mat. So you kind of get height and you get distance from each other and the movement from one to the other, as opposed to grappling, which is all about being close to somebody and maybe even getting into holds where it's actually the stillness rather than the movement and the kind of struggle to get out of being stuck effectively. Is that, tell me if I'm talking nonsense, but are there that feels like the distinctions between grappling and acrobatics, speed and distance and danger up here, as compared to being close to each other and it being about trying to escape where you are. So I don't know if that makes sense.
I would it makes sense to me. If we talk about Pro Wrestling Soul, for example, what they do a great job of doing is I think pretty much every show they'll have at least one traditional British rounds rules match, and that's a style that goes back to the 70s of 5-minute rounds. It's really based on grappling. You try. There's very little striking. It's all evading holds, escaping holds, transitioning into holds, and keeping things on the ground, keeping things gentlemanly as well, making it as sportsman. And I enjoy it so much because I love the sportsman, like the sports style of it, and B, I like it because I really enjoy how the crowd digests that kind of match, especially in this day and age, where on a soul card you'll see a match where there's a lot of high flying, and the crowd enjoys that just as much as they enjoy a British rounds match, where everything is pretty much where both feet are on the ground from both wrestlers nearly the whole time.
Yeah.
And they appreciate it differently but equally, which is my favorite thing. And it is because it's almost like it's a different language. It's almost like they're cousins. It's wrestling, but they're cousins, and distantly related. And but that's the variety of it, of like, oh, we can watch this kind of wrestling where it's like more chess of like, okay, I'm in this hold. How do I get out of this hold? And watching it, I don't like watch chess championships, but like I can imagine the intrigue as a spectator would be, I'm intrigued to see what move he's going to do to move, to get his queen out of harm's way, and that's the enjoyment of a rounds match. But then you can put that in a traditional, just a normal singles match.
Yeah.
Before it escalates into strikes and high fly. So,
yeah. I'm 39, and I think I'm probably the last generation to remember watching the kind of wrestling you're talking about in the mid 80s. I can still remember watching that as a kid, and I remember the men in my family, all of us just totally losing it over watching the matches, and it felt like everyone was watching wrestling on a Saturday. It felt quite gendered. It felt like all the men were watching wrestling on a Saturday, and that gentlemanly aspect you talk about. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory of that was that there's a really weird tension between the gentlemanliness and the rule-basedness of that style, and yet also that style was always about rule breakers and really invested in bad guy versus good guy. And I think it was kind of famous for grannies losing their minds in the front row of the matches and trying to get involved and telling people to sort themselves out and start behaving themselves. I don't know if that matches your experience of that style or any style, but there's that thing there too of rules and rule breaking that feels really built into how wrestling works in front of an audience.
For sure. I think the key is the more rules you have, in theory, it's better for the rule breaker because then there's more rules to break. But also it becomes more meaningful when a rule is broken, when things are contested normally in like a gentleman-like contest. So normally in world of sport, there'd be, I think the majority of the matches would probably be.
Sorry, say that again. You cut out there. Oh, lost the sound.
Fix that.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Right. I was just saying, on world of sport, I believe that most matches would be good guy versus good guy, so there wouldn't be a bad guy. So what it does is accentuate when there is a villain that is cheating, because you're seeing, so they've educated you on how a wrestling match should go. If it is just a down the middle, here are two people just trying to beat the other at this game, and then here's someone that is bending the rules. I remember watching a rounds match at Seoul with Daryl Allen, who's my trainer, and Jonathan Gresham. And it blew my mind. I was just watching it, and it blew my mind because like the underhanded tactic that Jonathan Gresham used was a punch. And as it happened, like everybody and stuff like that, and even myself, I was like, oh, I gasped because I was like, what? He actually punched him. And that's back to what I was saying about how like the card is so varied, because there was other matches beforehand where there was definitely just 20 punches per person per match at minimum. But when there's a punch here in the context of rules being laid down, and that it is underhanded, and there were 10 minutes beforehand of pure grappling, so it's almost as though there was a gentleman's agreement that there wouldn't be any striking involved.
Yeah,
seeing the ref isn't looking becomes the most underhanded thing you can do, and that, if there was a granny there, that's when they would have piped
up. That's fantastic. Thank you. Michael, we're coming towards the end of our conversation. Is there anything else I should ask you, or anything you'd like to tell our audience about wrestling, or anything really? Things I've missed?
I'm not sure. I really enjoyed Kafka's conversation. That was really fun. I remember. Do you know? He spoke about the analogy of salsa,
Yeah.
and that really resonated with me because I last year I went on a salsa date, as it were, and so and it's like in central London, and it was very interesting because like the idea was that like it's a restaurant, and in the restaurant on the other side of the room there's salsa classes. So
Yeah.
for about an hour there'll be a salsa class where they teach people, beginners or however, to do salsa, and you can watch them learning how to do salsa while you have your meal. And then once the salsa lesson's over, they open up dance floors for everybody, and then it stays open till late, and everybody's just dancing salsa. And me not knowing how to dance salsa, I'm looking at all the people who are on the floor, on the dance floor, and they are doing the wildest dance moves. And you just look, and in my head, I'm looking at like, look at all these couples. They must have been practicing these moves forever. And then you just see them immediately swap with somebody else. And you're like, and then they're doing just as good. And you're like, oh, okay. They've just been, they know the set. They have the tools to be so adept at dancing that they can just freestyle and feel the music and feel the body and go with it and create something special. And meanwhile, I'm there completely in deep water, trying to just focus on my footwork more than I am trying to learn how to spin and stuff. And I remember, that just harkens me back to like, that's what pro wrestling is as well, especially in the grappling sense of like, to some, it may look like, oh man, well, for that thing that they did in the ring there, they must have planned that loads of time for it to go well. But then when it comes down to it, it's based purely on just having the ability to by being trained so much and by being given the tools through training, that you can just do things on the fly.
Yeah.
That seem like they might be like choreographed for ages, but then they're actually an organic bit of wrestling.
Yeah.
So I just remember just being really fascinated by that salsa analogy, and there's probably loads more like that. And I just think it'd be cool if like, it'd be so cool that like, I always want people to understand that like wrestling is that thing that like, it's very difficult, as well as it being like a highly enjoyable piece of art, in my opinion.
Yeah, difficult as in highly skilled.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think that's the word. I think that's the wrestlers. Obviously there are some wrestlers that like go up in arms when they hear the word fake. If they hear it being called fake, they go crazy. And in fact, I know that Vice TV are doing like a new episode of Dark Side of the Ring coming up soon, literally about an infamous interview of David Schultz back in the 80s when a reporter said that it's fake, and then he slapped him, and then so they're doing a documentary about that, which I'm really excited to see. And I think but I understand the aspect of the reason that wrestlers have a problem with that word is because it implies, or it insinuates that it doesn't hurt and it's easy.
Yeah.
It's very dismissive in that sense. So I feel like in this day and age where like the goal is not to try and convince people that it's real. In this day and age, it's to convince people to respect it,
Yeah,
as a legitimate art form and a legitimate bit of entertainment, just as much as anything else, if not more so than other things. If you can love Love Island, wrestling, you can love even more, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is odd that people say it's fake. I mean, in comparison to what? Because again, theatre, you wouldn't really walk around going, by the way, those characters that just died on stage, they're alive and in the bar already.
That's it. It is. And so coming from the theatre world myself, that was always the wildest thing. I remember I'd only done a couple of plays before I decided to stop acting. I did a couple of plays while I was wrestling, while I was a wrestler. And I hadn't told them I was a wrestler. And somehow wrestling came up into conversation backstage before we're about to go and do a show. Well, while we were all like, it was probably 5 minutes before, we're just talking, whatever. And yeah, they just started talking about wrestling. And I was just kind of listening. I didn't want to like say, hey, I'm a wrestler. And then I remember them saying, and then I stopped watching when I realized it wasn't real. And then I just, in my head, I was like, I was just thinking, do they not see the irony of that they stopped watching something because it was real, and they're about to go on stage and perform theater. So,
yeah.
So that's the weird double standard that as coming from the acting world, I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
Yeah, and it's totally bizarre. And again, Kathka in our last video also using the analogy of football, and people don't spontaneously arrive at a football match and start playing. There's again, there are kind of genres and conventions they fit into in order to turn up just to have the match to begin with. And you've made us think, this is the last thing I'll say I think in this conversation, but you've made us think about improvisation and choreography and training and how those things all fit together. And again, from a historical point of view, I'm pretty sure that's how theatre used to work. In Shakespeare's time, there was basically no rehearsal at all. And people would just show up and they would say, all right, so this play's got this fight scene and this sex or flirtation scene. So we'll do fight number 8 and we'll do flirtation scene number 6. And just kind of fit into that notion of, you were talking about, of improv within, not so much choreography, but kind of within training, within skills.
I didn't know that, and that's awesome to find out, because that's probably one of the best ways to describe it. People would, even like new wrestlers are always in shock, let alone fans are shocked to know how little rehearsal there is, which is, well, like when I think choreography, again, coming from theater, I think, 1 month minimum of rehearsals. But when it comes to wrestling, it's sometimes, arriving at Belfast Airport, getting to the venue, after doors, meeting your opponent for the first time. You're on in an hour, and then and then performing a match for 20 minutes, and then getting back in an airport and leaving. And then the fans will look at that, and some fans, even the fans that like highly respect it, will be like, "This is awesome and this is great," but they probably think, "Oh man," but they probably been choreographing for maybe a week or so, and sometimes you meet the person at the venue. You're introducing yourself sometimes as a person to the person, and then you're putting on, you're simulating combat and making it make sense, which is that's my favorite part of wrestling. How you can, in a short space of time, just make people like enjoy something for 20 minutes.
Yeah, what you do, Michael, is amazing, completely amazing. I'm so thrilled we're having these videos to talk about it and unpack it. And the way you've talked about making it make sense is a really great way of thinking about it. That idea of emoting pain and thinking about how to communicate that to an audience is really fascinating as well. I sort of wish we had another hour to talk about some of that, but I'm really thrilled with this conversation. So thank you very much for telling us everything you've told us.
Oh, no, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk wrestling, I guess, especially during this pandemic where I'm not able to wrestle. Talking about it is the next best thing.
Yeah, it's not a very socially distancing friendly sport, is it? We all need to take up golf.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. That is it. That'd be perfect.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really good to talk to you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you for having me.